What's up, everyone? Matt Gajewski here. Back again talking some college basketball. It is Monday, February the 17th. Little bit of a slow night on deck for us before we get to tonight's action, breaking down some of the bigger games and some of the mid-majors. Let's circle back to yesterday's and recap the action from Sunday the 16th, which was actually a pretty big day, not just up top, but we had some movement in some of the lower conferences. I think first and foremost, we need to start with the ranked matchup. It was Creighton taking on St. John's. St. John's gets a 6-point win. Weird game. Kalkbrenner left for a period of time with a foot injury. He comes back. Obviously, it wasn't good when he was off the floor. He changes the dynamic of Creighton's offense. But St. John's continues to frustrate Creighton really every time they match up. Ashworth had another lackluster game, to be kind. First time these teams played, he had 10 turnovers, and yesterday he was just missing a lot of threes. Finishes 7 of 17, ends up 4 of 12 from threes. It's not quite as bad as it could have been, and he had 23 points, but that's still quite a few missed shots. Only 4 turnovers for him in this game, but they still turned it over 15 times as a team, whereas St. John's only turned it over 5 times. And when Creighton shoots 27% from three and St. John's shoots 33%, it's going to be hard to win that kind of game. So that's what we had in the big game up top. Memphis lost to Wichita State. This is just classic Memphis. They cover early in the week and then they lose a game like this. There's not really too much for me to say. They've been losing these games ever since Penny took over the job. They're going to lose a couple of these games every year. That's about all I have to say about Memphis. Michigan beats Ohio State on the road. Michigan's going to be tough to beat when they don't turn the ball over. Both of their bigs had excellent games in this spot, which was the best matchup against Ohio State, who's not playing a very big lineup right now. That wasn't too out of the ordinary, I thought. Maryland absolutely beats down Iowa. This was pretty expected. Iowa, no interest in playing defense. They did not get Thelwell back, so Freeman and Thelwell were out. We had a pair of double-doubles from Reese and Queen in the game. All of the guards played well. Maryland is a wagon right now. To get to some of the lower games, Bradley gets the win over Drake. This is one we were considering, didn't end up taking, but we talked about some of the advantages Bradley had in that game. So seeing Drake fall, that was a loss they couldn't take. Drake basically needs to win their conference now if they're going to make March Madness. They were live for an at-large bid, but the problem with these teams that are pretty good, but they play in these bad conferences, you just can't take losses. Power teams do not have the same resume as you. So when you take a loss, you get knocked down so far. We saw this with like Indiana State last year, who didn't win their conference and couldn't get in at large. I myself attended the Milwaukee game in the Horizon. They got a big win. And there was an important game up top in that conference. Youngstown State upset Cleveland State. That's basically the top of the league right now. So Cleveland State still holds a half game advantage. They're 12-4 overall in conference, whereas Robert Morris and Youngstown State are 12-5. Milwaukee's sitting about a game back, a half game back, depending on who you're playing. They're at 11-5 in the conference. So we've got a bit of a log jam at the top of the Horizon. It was a bit interesting, not to mention Green Bay won their game. That has nothing to do with the top, but just want to highlight good old Green Bay pulling out a victory. We haven't seen them win a game since November, something like that. Otherwise, other power games, Northwestern gets a crazy come-from-behind loss to Nebraska. Almost flipped those there. Louisville beats Notre Dame by 15. Pretty easy to see. Oregon routs Rutgers. Rutgers having to come across the country after an overtime game. They only have 2 good players, not the most surprising. And that's about it. We did bet South Dakota against we bet South Dakota State against South Dakota. That finishes 94-91. Just crazy fireworks if you had that game on. I'm surprised the margin of victory was that narrow. There were a lot of like micro edges in that game for South Dakota State, but awesome game overall. And, we bet a lot of games, so we'll win some and we'll lose some. Let's spin this forward. As you've noticed by now, we will talk about betting on this show. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, please call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. We're going to talk about 8 games today, and we're going to start at the top and then work our way to the mid-majors. Before we get into it, one thing that would really help me if you enjoy this is liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. We're only 928 subscribers away from being able to make a few cents off the video. If you've done any of those things, thank you. It does help a ton. And if you have feedback, the show is new. We're trying to figure out structures and how to best optimize this for your viewing. All right. Arizona takes on Baylor. This is probably the best game of the night. It's in the Big 12, the top of the Big 12. Arizona just lost to Houston over the weekend. Crazy game there. Baylor they played a semi-crazy game as well. They won in overtime against West Virginia. Injuries aren't really too big in this game. Oji Nwunua for Baylor is out, their center. Can never say his name correctly, so sorry, Josh. But both these teams come into this game with elite schedules. They're both top 8 in strength of schedule. They also played once already this year. That was on January 14th. Arizona won 81-70. That was on their home floor. Baylor has been a revolving door of injuries all season long. They did not have Langston Love or Jalen Celestine in that game. They're both back now. As far as resume goes, both these teams lack a little bit up top. Arizona's 2-4 against top 10 teams. One of those victories against Iowa State required, a half-court heave from Caleb Love to even get the game into OT. They ended up getting it done there. Arizona's lost 3 times outside the top 40. I think their third best win is against Baylor, number 29. They have no other top 30 wins other than the ones we mentioned in the Baylor game. So that puts 3 wins in the top 30 for them on the year. Baylor's 0-4 against top 10 teams. They're 2-6 against top 20 teams. They don't have as many questionable losses as Arizona, but they do have one major questionable loss. That's TCU, who's 84th in the country. That would be the worst loss on either resume. And Baylor's been living dangerously, I think partially because of injuries, but beating West Virginia in OT is not the greatest data point either. As far as this team goes, how they match up, Arizona should have a massive advantage inside. They're 96th in effective height. Baylor's 232nd. Arizona's 11th in rebounding. Baylor's 87th. I think those height metrics could get even worse for Baylor now that their center's off the floor. They're basically going to play Norchad Omier at the 5, who's an excellent rebounder for being 6'7", but it's just a weird lineup composition for them. Arizona's 45th in interior scoring. Baylor's 150th in interior defense. I mean, Baylor actually kind of struggles on defense entirely, not just inside. Basically, VJ Edgecombe and Norchad Omier, they're only decent defenders. On top of being 150th in interior defense, they're 315th in perimeter defense. That's probably not as big of a concern in this matchup because Arizona just flat out can't shoot this year. They're 298th from 3. But this team wins in other ways. They're actually pretty long, which we mentioned. Against Houston, I was impressed with their ability to get out in transition and score on a really physical defense. I think that was corrected by Houston a little bit. In the first half, I don't know why they were doing this, but they kept throwing the ball into the interior to Tugler and Juwan Roberts, who are their worst offensive players. And you were seeing them take these just atrocious shots from the elbow. I mean, hook shots. I don't know why Juwan keeps doing this, but it led to a lot of long rebounds where Houston ended up being out of position and Arizona could run right down the floor and get baskets in transition or fouls in transition. I'm not sure that's going to be a problem in this game because Houston corrected a lot of those issues. They play more physical. They show a lot more effort defensively than Baylor. So Arizona still probably is able to do some of those transition things. I think Arizona is going to have success in the half court, at least more so than they did against Houston with their athleticism and Baylor's inability to defend. But at the end of the day, this is still a pretty unique lineup for Baylor. They're playing extremely small with Norchad at the 5. I wish they would pick up their pace a little bit and try to run some of these Arizona bigs off the floor, but Baylor has not shown any willingness to speed up. That might be because they've been so hurt this year. For the record, they've only slowed since January 1. I think the real path for Baylor winning this game is just shooting a lot of threes. They're 73rd in three-point percentage. The problem is Arizona is 11th at defending threes. They're very good for all their inability to shoot themselves. They do give effort on defense. We make this game a little inside the 1.5, barely 75.3 for Arizona, 76.5 for Baylor. That would give us a lean Arizona's direction. I might play this. I've been back and forth on this all morning. I'm not sure. But one thing I did play, because I live in Wisconsin, I need to use the Prize Picks underdogs of the world, and you need a pairing. I used Toby Awaka as my pairing for a prop we'll talk about a little later, under 7.5 points. He is getting run off the floor by Vsar, and they did get Townsend back, so less minutes for Awaka. He's not a scorer to begin with. That's one that I think is pretty solid here still. We won that one over the weekend. Going to game 2, we will head to the disaster of the ACC where Duke finds himself as another double-digit favorite against Virginia. It's a 15-point spread. The total in the game is 131.5. The over is screaming upward. It was 129 last night. Duke is taking money. I took Duke at the 14.5. And to get into the stylistics, the resumes, Duke actually probably not quite as impressive as you might think. They're 2-3 against top 25 teams. With that said, all their losses did come by single digits. They have a win over number 1 Auburn. And all of those games occurred before December 9th, except for one. That was the Clemson game they just played where Cooper Flagg was sick, played through it. And if you wanted to make the argument that those losses might have benefited Duke, I could see it. They're one of the youngest teams in college basketball. You know, you play 4 top 25 teams before conference play even starts. That does leave a lot of room for Duke to grow. Virginia is just atrocious. This team has 2 top 100 wins all season. They were against number 55 Villanova, number 51 Pitt. They've been respectable in a few of their losses, but not many of them. They're playing at a bottom 5 pace still. Duke's more than happy to play that game. They're 279th in pace. Virginia is 33rd in height, which matches up theoretically against Duke's 9th tallest lineup. But the problem is their big men are awful. Virginia is outside the top 200 in interior scoring, rebounding. Duke is basically near the top 10 in every single metric, and within those metrics in a ton of spots. So I'm not just going to run through Duke's efficiency profile. You know Duke is good. You know Flagg, you know Knipple, you know Sion James, and Proctor, and Malawach, and Brown. They're elite. They're deep. Fouls aren't a problem. Bad play from one guy's not a problem. Even at the slow pace that Duke is playing, I mean, this team is pushing like 85 points on a nightly basis. They're overpowering with their efficiency. How is Virginia going to keep up? If they do, it has to be with threes, I think. This team is 25th nationally in three-point percentage, and that's their only path. They need to hit more threes than we expect. Duke is pretty good at three-point defense. It's maybe their weakness. They're 72nd there. But this team is so long at guard. I flat out don't see Virginia scoring a lot of points in this game. I think you could play this a number of ways. I think Duke minus 14.5 is just fine. We make it outside that number. I think if you wanted to hit Duke's team total over, it's fine. If you wanted to do Virginia's team total under, it's fine. Any way you can really play Duke in this game is fine with me. We'll keep back in the Blue Devils, and they keep winning a lot of these games and covering spreads, even as massive favorites. They just did so, putting up 100 against Stanford over the weekend. Last major conference game before we head to some of the mids. Kansas State takes on Utah. This game is a 2-point spread in favor of the home Utah team, and the total in the game is 146. There's no major injuries. There haven't been in any of these games. It's really just Baylor's center. But I've kind of just been throwing my hands up at Kansas State games and not taking a side one way or the other. I'm just not really sure what to say about this team. One night they beat Iowa State in Kansas, and they look like the team that spent a fortune on the roster. And the next night they look like Mississippi Valley State. I don't know what team is going to show up night to night with Kansas State. They just took a 15-point loss to BYU at Elevation on Saturday. They're playing in a similar environment, and they have less rest. What are we going to see? To get into the stylistics, both teams are tall, effective height-wise. But so far this year, only Utah has been competent at using their size. They're 51st in rebounding, 56th at interior scoring, 23rd in interior defense. Osar and Lovering grade out as 2 of the top 3 defenders on the team for Utah. And Kansas State, for being as tall as they are, they're just so incompetent. 233rd in rebounding, 103rd in interior scoring, 105th in interior defense. Frankly, Coleman Hawkins and David Gasson have been disappointments. And Onyenso, one of the guys at center they spent money on, can't even get onto the floor. This guy has played like 6 total minutes in the last 3 games. I don't know what to say. Kansas State is the slightly better shooting team. They're 137th in three-point percentage. Utah's 179th, and both of these teams are middling at perimeter defense. So not really sure there's a lot of edge and guard play for either teams. On paper, Kansas State is a lot more talented. Foul margin and turnover margin come in about equal in this game, so it's extremely volatile, and it's pretty greasy. Both these teams not great at shooting even from the stripe. Both outside the top 300 in free throw shooting. Like, give me a break with this. This is a horrible Kansas State team based on expectation. But the problem I have with them is just look at their roster. Like, they're a better team than Utah. They should be favored in this game, probably by like 6 or 7 points. And they probably would have been if this game was in non-con, but it's not. and we have data points, and we know Kansas State is not living up to expectations. So it's just going to be a stay away for me. Intuition tells me Kansas State should win this game. Modeling tells me it's a little closer to Utah covering the spread. If you forced me to pick, I'd probably play Kansas State. I'm not going to. The one thing I did play in this game was David Ngessen over a half an assist. He's averaging 1.5 per game. This game has a higher total than some other Utah spots. I think this is a pretty solid bet overall. But let's get to the mid-majors. I'm done talking about Kansas State and Big 12 play. There's actually some awesome games tonight. It's highlighted by the Southland Conference, the SWAC, the MEAC. There's one Patriot League game. We won't talk about that. But the Southland's actually very interesting at the top, and a lot of the top teams play each other, which is going to lead to an awesome mid-major night. McNeese is the number 1 team in the Southland Conference. There's a little bit of a logjam at number 2, but Southeastern Louisiana is involved in that. So this technically is a 1-2 matchup in the Southland Conference. Injuries aren't a huge factor in the game. Alan Breed has been out basically the entire year for McNeese. He's only played in 3 games. This is also a rematch. McNeese took the first game in blowout fashion on their home floor. Now they have to hit the road. The teams are built differently. Louisiana is a little bit more homegrown. Their only real transfers are Sam Hines and Buckley. They come from USF and Lamar. McNeese is built entirely through the transfer portal. It's a Will Wade team. They're the only team really spending a lot of money in this conference, or at least they're pacing people. But like Copeland's from Syracuse, Parker's from St. Louis, Garcia from UMass, Shoemate from Tulsa, Richards from UTSA, Brandon Murray from everywhere. He's played at LSU, Ole Miss, Georgetown. Joe Charles is from Louisiana. Sela Bangu from Arizona State last year. This is a good roster. It's not a roster that normally is found at this level of competition, and it shows. As far as just power rankings in this conference, they are well ahead, and they're usually coming in double-digit favorites in most games. They're not here because they're on the road and playing the number 2 team in the conference. As far as stylistics go, Southeastern Louisiana is 340th in three-point rates. They have a pretty middling three-point percentage. I'm actually surprised they don't take more threes. They're 215th in three-point percentage. I honestly think this is kind of a path for them if they decide to shoot more, but they haven't. They're 186th in effective height. McNeese is 281st. You'd think that would be an edge for Southeastern Louisiana, but McNeese still holds edges, rebounding, scoring inside, defense really across the board. And I think it's just talent. McNeese is not a Southland roster. The only place where you have Southeastern Louisiana ranking ahead of McNeese in terms of efficiency, this is outside of the height metrics. They have a slightly better three-point defense. They're a little bit better in fouls generated, and they have a better free throw percentage. Otherwise, everything in this game favors McNeese State. If you ask me just about the score efficiency metrics in the game, it looks pretty efficient to me. We make this basically right on the spread with the ever slightest of margins, McNeese State's direction, which is where I would lean. And it comes down to just the talent for this team far surpasses that of Southeastern Louisiana. Awesome game in this conference. Would be a surprise if McNeese lost, but this is the top of the Southland games you definitely need to pay attention to. Remaining in this conference, we have another team in this logjam at number 2. This is the Southland again. It's Lamar taking on Northwestern State. Lamar is a 2-point underdog. The total is 131.5. And again, I guess you would technically have Lamar 3 because of tiebreakers, but they are tied with Southeastern Louisiana in this conference for number 2. Northwestern State is 6th. I'm a little surprised this is a spot where you can catch Lamar as an underdog. I show quite a bit of value on this. I dug in as far as I possibly could to see if I was missing an injury, some sort of context. I didn't find anything. Reporting is not good in this conference, so that doesn't mean I didn't miss something. I may have. If I missed something, leave it in the comments. But I haven't shown this much value on a number in a while, and it's on the Lamar side. Disclaimer aside, these teams already played once. That was on January 27th. Lamar won 69-59. That was on their home floor. They're hitting the road now. Overall, that was a pretty bad game for both teams. It came down to free throws. Northwestern State missed 12 of them. And I don't think they would have won even if they made all of them, but it would have cut the deficit at least. As far as stylistics go, Lamar is 69th in effective height. Northwestern State comes in 218th. With that said, all these efficiency metrics that are influenced by height are basically dead even. Rebounding, scoring inside, interior defense. The place where you see Lamar really pull away from Northwestern State is on the perimeter. They're 89th in three-point percentage. Northwestern is 231st. So you have a big shooting gap. That gap does extend to defense, where Lamar's a lot better at defending the perimeter too, which is a little bit of a surprise considering the composition of their lineup. The real advantage, I think, Northwestern State's direction is their strength of schedule. I'm not sure why they played a schedule so difficult. But when you look at it and actually dive into the weeds, it just looks to me like they got pounded by a lot more high major power teams. Northwestern State has 3 wins in the top 200. They beat Nichols twice, who's at 191. And they did have a pretty big win against 114th ranked North Alabama. They have 2 losses outside the top 300. And that's a pretty comparable schedule to Lamar, who has 3 wins in the top 200 as well. They beat Corpus Christi twice. They're 177th. And they also beat Nichols, who's 191st again. They lost outside the top 300 one time. That was to New Orleans. So when you just remove Northwestern State scheduled a bunch of high major powerhouses that beat the snot out of them, these resumes look pretty even. So we're showing a lot of value on the Lamar side. We actually have them favored in this game. Again, disclaimer, I could not find an injury. That doesn't mean there isn't one. I'm a little nervous based on this number because I rarely show this much value. And generally speaking, I'll speak for myself here. If something looks like there's a big error, it's probably not on their end. And most likely I'm wrong. So take this with a grain of salt. I did play the Lamar. I played a +1.5. It's moved away from me. Another bad sign, but as long as this comes out clean, Lamar is, I think, a pretty solid play in this conference. Let's move forward to the SWAC. Definitely not the same caliber conference as the Southland. Southland, I wouldn't be surprised if McNeese State won a game in the tournament. I'd be pretty surprised if one of these teams won a conference game, a tournament game, I should say. But we have Jackson State taking on Bethune-Cookman. This is a pretty interesting game overall. Top of the conference for sure. Injury-wise, Jackson State, Marcus Watson. For Bethune-Cookman, I think theirs are a little more impactful. It's Braylon Freeman and Reggie Ward Jr. For the side in total, Jackson State is a 2.5-point underdog. The total in the game is 145. I think the biggest injury things to monitor in this game, or I guess to even just speak about it, is Jackson State hasn't really been healthy all year. They've only had one player that's in their rotation play every game, and now they're mostly healthy. Outside of Watson, everyone should play in this game, and he's not one of their bigger contributors. It's been a really weird ride for Jackson State. They went 0 of 13 in their first 13 games, but they played a crazy schedule. The lowest ranked team in that span was Cal Baptist at 155. Since then, this conference doesn't have anyone really ranked close to that. They did lose to Florida A&M twice, who's at 320th, and they only have one top 300 win all year. That was 270th Bethune-Cookman. But you just look at this conference, everyone's hovering around 300th or worse. The SWAC is not a strong conference. So their record, especially non-con, doesn't do a lot for me. They were expected to get slaughtered by all the teams they faced. And now in conference play, it's about what I have expected. Bethune-Cookman has a much weaker schedule, but they do have a few more wins, especially in the top 200. They beat 199th South Florida, 217th South Carolina State, and 279th North Dakota. They do have 2 losses outside the top 300. Both were to Alcorn State, which is, I think the resumes are pretty comparable when you remove the non-conference nonsense. These teams played already. Jackson State won 86-81 in their home building on January 25th. Of course, Jackson State had an injury. They didn't have Jamie Mitchell, but otherwise this was a pretty healthy game on both sides. The biggest difference in the game was Bethune-Cookman had 18 turnovers to Jackson State's 10. So you ended up with a lot of points off turnovers. Interior, I think this comes into Bethune-Cookman. They should have the advantage here. Jackson State's taller, but somehow Jackson State is 350th in interior scoring, 269th in rebounding. Bethune-Cookman is 221st in rebounding, 111th in interior defense, decent at scoring. So they have some pretty sharp advantages inside despite not being tall. Neither team takes a lot of three-pointers, and both teams are actually horrible at shooting them. Jackson State's a little better, so I guess a micro advantage there, but not expecting either of these teams to shoot a ton. Both these teams will turn the ball over like crazy. Bethune-Cookman doesn't force any, but Jackson State does. They're 108th in turnovers forced. Again, that was a huge point in the first game. So to me, I think Jackson State's the more talented team. They have Ruffin, who's an Ole Miss transfer, playing point guard for them. And their statistical profile is just tricky because of that non-conference play. And it's not just that. All the injuries, all these are going to influence your overall efficiency metrics in a negative way. So I think there is a potential that this team is better than what we're seeing on paper because they played so many games hurt and their non-con was so rigorous. Both teams are 8-4 in the conference. They trail only Southern. There's this in the SWAC. We talked about a logjam in the Southland. Southern's at the top of the SWAC. And then there's, I think, 5 teams tied at 8-4 in the conference for second. Overall, we lean Jackson State in this game. Projected score 69.7 to 71.8. I'm debating playing this. I think if you were to give Jackson State just a normal strength of schedule, they might be closer to Bethune Cookman in overall score in this game. Let's continue with the SWAC, where we have the number 1 team, Southern, playing at home against Texas Southern, another team in that logjam of second place at 8-4 in the conference. This game's a little wider in terms of the spread. You see Texas Southern as a 7-point underdog. The total is 144. Only injury in the game is Jalen Weisinger on Texas Southern. Not good for them. And again, Southern holds a first place edge. I think it's pretty drastic when you just look at power rankings. Southern is 39 spots higher than any other team in this conference. Pretty wild. This team, Southern, that is, already beat Texas Southern in their first matchup. That was on January 4th. It was 67-58. That was in Texas Southern's building too. Southern won like every single major statistical category, and they held Texas Southern below 30% from the floor. Not from 3, from the floor. Crazy statistic. Both these teams have a strength on defense, but with that said, it's just vastly in favor of Southern. They're almost 100 spots ahead of Texas Southern in total defense. Same thing goes for rebounding. Southern's in the top 100. Texas Southern's outside the top 300. Both these teams have problems scoring and are outside the top 300 in effective field goal percentage, but just so many of the micro edges favor Southern that I think it's hard for them to lose this game. They're also 54th in offensive rebounding. So, both teams are shooting bricks. One team is getting second chance opportunities, one team's not. I think the market comes in pretty efficient on this game, but just wanted to highlight some of the teams in the SWAC that have massive implications tonight. It's a Southerner pass for me. We make it nearly 66 points to 73 points, so pretty in line with the model. To close this out, we'll head to the MEAC. Delaware State takes on Norfolk State. I guess I should say this before we go on because I always forget to talk about stuff. We already mentioned liking the video if you want to support. One other way you can, there's a Discord channel that I run. We do projections for every game, that's size totals, player projections. So that's applicable to props for all the major games on the slate. So we did that for the top 3 contests we talked about. If you're interested in that, the link to the Discord is below. All right, to the MEAC. Delaware State, 9-point underdog to Norfolk State. The total's 148. Only injury in the game is Jalen Myers on Norfolk State. These teams already played. Norfolk won on January 6th, 73-64. That was on Delaware State's floor. It was a poor shooting night for everyone. Norfolk only hit 28.6% of their threes, but it was even worse for Delaware State. Technically, this is a 1-2 matchup in the conference, but I'll give you the power ratings for the top 3 teams. It's not pretty. Norfolk State is number 1 by a mile. They're 174th. Delaware State is tied for second with South Carolina State. South Carolina State is 217th. Delaware State is 294th. Somehow Delaware State upset South Carolina State already, but both of those teams are 5-3 in conference, but we're fully expecting Norfolk to represent the MEAC in March Madness. Both these teams have a top 100 lineup in terms of effective height. Rebounding numbers are pretty neutral, but Norfolk State is over 200 spots ahead of Delaware State in interior scoring and interior defense. So just a massive advantage for Norfolk. Delaware State is 164th in three-point percentage. Norfolk is 296th. The problem is neither team shoots a lot of threes. I don't know why Delaware is not shooting more, but they absolutely should. It's going to require an outlier game from 3, I think, for them to win this contest. And remember, they had just a horrific shooting performance in the first matchup. Resume-wise, both these teams don't have a lot of opportunities. This is a horrible conference that generally isn't live to win tournament games. Norfolk did beat 146 James Madison and number 91, shout out Ben Raza, High Point in non-conference. Delaware State has one top 300 win all year. That was their upset win over South Carolina State. So it's a very tough conference. I don't think Norfolk is live to win a tournament game if they get there. You just can't really be this bad at shooting threes, in my opinion. for reference, you play through your big men inside if you're Norfolk State. You're just going to run into teams that have better bigs than you. It just is what it is. In this matchup, I think you could maybe look to Norfolk State. Delaware being so good shooting scares me, but we make this outside the projected score of 10. Barely, but that is the case. Norfolk State or pass for me, and that'll do it for us today. If you have feedback, please leave it below. Much appreciated. Trying to grow this channel slowly but surely. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Matt_Gajewski, doing a ton of college basketball content there. Otherwise, we'll see you guys tomorrow for a big Tuesday slate. Until then, good luck. We'll catch you next time.